This lecture is about causal research in marketing, and I'll be limiting most of my comments to experiments. Some more comments on experimental error. I briefly mentioned earlier internal validity and external validity. These terms refer respectively to the logic of the experiment or the logic of the connection between the independent variable and the dependent variable. That's internal validity. So an internally valid experiment is one in which we are fairly certain that changes in the dependent variable are the result of the manipulation of the independent variable. External validity refers to the generalization of the effect. If we see an effect in an experiment, will we also see an effect in another situation? It could be another experimental situation, or it could be a mundane marketplace situation. So, threats to internal validity. And these are some terms that are useful as ways to describe causal research. History, maturation, mortality all refer to naturally occurring changes within the experiment. And they're problems when experiments occur over time. So a researcher might, for example, look at advertising change and measure sales at one point in time, then introduce the advertising, let the advertising run for 3 months, and then look at sales after the advertising, and try to infer the effect of advertising on sales by looking at the sales before and the sales 3 months later. Now, obviously, there are other things that change in the course of 3 months. Those would be history effects. That is something that's happening in the local history. Seasonality would be one thing. If you were looking at sales of a seasonal product, you would expect to see some differences. Competitive activity is certainly another possibility. Advertising effectiveness might be reduced if competitors were engaged in some sort of promotion during that 3-month interval. Mortality is an issue. Mortality is the loss of subjects between conditions. It could be literal mortality, and that is that subjects die. More typically, it's subjects simply dropping out and not participating. So a study of advertising might be done in an area that's rapidly growing or rapidly shrinking, and you simply wouldn't have the same people involved in the second measure as the first measure. Maturation, the middle term there, is used to describe a more specific problem with human subjects that is their naturally occurring change over time. So maturation, in its most obvious application, would be a study that's done over time with children, for example, where they're growing older and they have naturally occurring changes in cognitive development or social activities, interests, and such. But it also can be used to describe changes over time that are for much smaller time periods. For example, if you're advertising a food product and you have people, you take your measures a couple of hours apart, you expect people to get hungry in even a time span of a couple of hours. So that can be an issue. The second problem is a testing effect. Testing is the effect of one measure on another measure. So, for example, if I were to assess a new teaching technique, and I gave you a pre-test on the material, and then I taught, and then I gave a post-test on the material, and the post-test was better than the pre-test, then I might infer that the teaching actually caused that improvement. But it might be that you remembered the questions from the first time, and though that memory of the first measure might have a direct effect on the second one. One possibility is that you would answer exactly the same way on the second one as you remember answering on the first one. Now, if that were the case, then there would be no difference, and I would infer that the teaching didn't work, when in fact it might have worked, but what I was measuring was really a testing effect. Another possibility is that the first measure would interact with the manipulation. And this is the more problematic one usually for marketers. And that is that taking the measures initially changes the expectations or the attention of the participants. So for example, if I were doing an advertising study, let's say I was doing ads for the Microsoft Surface Pro, and I took measures of your initial awareness and beliefs about the Microsoft Surface Pro, and then I show you ads for the Microsoft Surface Pro, and then later I took measures of your interest in the Microsoft Surface Pro. And what I find is that you're more interested in the product after the ads than before, and I infer that the ads worked to increase interest and intention. Well, what's likely is that, at least in part, because you were asked about the Microsoft Surface Pro to begin with, you noticed the ad and paid attention to the ad and thought about the ad. And although the ad may indeed have changed your opinions and interest, it's only because you had this heightened sensitivity due to the first measure. So if I were to show this ad to people who had not been measured before, they may not pay attention to the ad at all. So the ad works in the experiment because the experiment included that first test. Demand effects we've talked about earlier, experiments that create some expectation of what the hypothesis is, either through the instructions or for an initial measure, may result in people responding in ways that are responsive to that hypothesis, either confirming it or negating it. Instrument change is usually not a problem. Instrument change would be when the measurement is different, either before and after or between groups. Occasionally a researcher will realize after the pretest that a question was not scaled properly or was confusing and change that question, and then end up doing a comparison between two different measures. Selection bias, we've talked about earlier. You need to be careful that the people who in different conditions are the same, so that you eliminate individual differences between the two groups. External validity threats, subject and sample representativeness are the big issues. In order to control for alternative explanations, in order to control for individual differences, lots of experiments are done with homogeneous groups in sterile, controlled, laboratory-type environments. That means the subjects are not representative of the marketplace. In the marketplace, there's naturally occurring heterogeneity. You've got all different ages, all different family cycles, all different religions, all different levels of knowledge, different backgrounds and experiences. But in an experiment, in order to improve internal validity, you might have all 20 to 22-year-old middle class mostly white college students. And clearly they don't represent the marketplace for most products. And likewise, a laboratory situation is not the same as people's homes or people's experiences on the internet or people's experiences in retail stores. And reactivity describes the way people are responding to those situations, the way people are responding to the fact that they know they're in an experiment, the way they're responding to the presentation of stimuli in an artificial way. That can represent itself as demand effects or testing effects and threaten internal validity, but it also clearly affects external validity, because it means that you might get an effect in an experimental situation where attention in particular is high and carefully focused, and not get that effect in real life in the marketplace, where people's attention is focused on other things and they're have very little concern for marketing stimuli. There are very many experimental designs and very many factors that are useful to describe experimental designs. I'll talk about just a few. The first is the general distinction between field experiments and laboratory experiments. This is often referred to as a dichotomy, but it's really a spectrum. A field experiment on the far end of the spectrum is a natural environment. Marketing test markets, for example, are real life, naturally occurring marketing where a product may be on the shelf in the stores in one version of a package and on the shelf in other stores in another form of the package, and the experiment is to see whether the package design has an effect on sales. So everything is real. The only difference is that package has been modified, package design has been modified. So subjects don't know they're in an experiment. Retailers may or may not know that they're part of the experiment. So everything is done to enhance the external validity of the study. At the other end of the spectrum, in a lab experiment, subjects are very carefully chosen to minimize individual differences. They know they're in an experiment. They may be in a very controlled environment. They might even be in a medical lab in a chair with electrodes attached to their brain. So it's a very artificial situation that's designed to eliminate alternative explanations. Now, a couple of condition designs. After-only design, illustrated here with X's and O's. X's and O's are the standard symbology for experimental designs. X representing an independent variable or manipulation, and O standing in for an observation or a measure of a dependent measure. So an after-only study is XO. So something happens, that's the X, and then we observe some effect, that's the O. So this is a case study. We read a case about REI. REI did this thing, and we see what happened to REI. Now, can we conclude that what happened was a result of the X, what they did? Well, remember, that's the purpose of the experiment, is to infer some causation, but there's clearly no control for alternative explanations here. We don't know whether the O that we see later is different from the O that we would have seen before the X. We don't know whether the O is a result of the X or whether the O was a result of something else in the environment. We don't know whether the O would have been bigger or better if we'd had some other X. So clearly limited in the kinds of interpretations we can make from it. Now an improvement is a one group before and after. So this gives us an O before the X and an O after the X. So we can at least talk about changes in the dependent measure as a result of X. The major problem here is that we don't, well, there are two. We don't know whether there are environmental factors that would have caused the O's to be different, excuse me, regardless of X. And also we don't know the testing effects. We don't know whether the second O is influenced by the first O, either directly or through an interaction with X. So if we measure sales, and then we do an ad campaign, and then we measure sales again, we don't know whether the sales the second time are the result of people's somehow being measured before the advertising campaign. A two groups design, this is a two groups after only, introduces a control group. The control group here is the second group that has no X. So control group typically is the group that gets no treatment. So here we have one group that gets a treatment or manipulation and is observed, and a second group doesn't get the treatment and is observed. And I'm sorry, that O is misplaced slightly. It's important that those O's occur at the same time, so I have an extra space in my slide. So now we've eliminated or attempted to eliminate history effects, because both of these groups are sharing a history. Whatever happens in terms of competitive activity or economic change or political or social change between the time X occurs and the time the observation is made happens to both groups. So if the first O is better or larger than the second O, we are more comfortable presuming that that was the result of X, because that's we presume to be the only difference between the two. And it's that presumption that represents the biggest challenge to this design, and that is the presumption that the only difference between the groups is X. You'll notice there's no measure of the two groups initially. So we could have a two groups before and after design, and those first two O's would assure us that the two groups were initially identical. But then, of course, we introduce the problem of testing effects, where the first measure somehow influences the second measure. And the solution to that is an even more complicated design, a four-group design, where you have two groups of before and after, and then two groups with after only. That's called a Solomon four-group. Solomon was a psychologist who proposed that. And it's obviously a complex and expensive experiment to run, but it does allow one to examine history effects and testing effects and isolate those from the experimental effects. Another experimental design is a time series design. So this uses only one group, but multiple measures and multiple manipulations. So essentially it uses the same group as experimental condition and control condition. So this is frequently used to look at price promotions, for example. So you might have, as illustrated here, a measure of sales and then another measure of sales, and those first two observations give the researcher a sense of the control condition. And then X is a price promotion. So we can, and then we see another observation. So we can see whether the price promotion had an effect by comparing the third O with the first two O's. And then we introduce another price promotion and another observation, and another price promotion and another observation. And the benefit of this time series is that we get replications of the effect, and B, we sort of minimize the testing effect problem, because that by the time we've got to the third or the fourth introduction of the independent variable, the subjects or the participants are used to the measures, they're used to the interaction, the novelty of the manipulation, and we start to get a cleaner effect of the long-term effect of the independent variable. Now, time series are expensive in terms of time, obviously, so that's one of their major drawbacks. Another advantage is that history effects tend to be minimized, because it's difficult to come up with an explanation, a historical explanation that would account for repeated effects of the independent variable. So if we only had one, we could say, well, maybe it was competitive activity, or maybe it was a blip in the economy, or maybe it was a blip in social trending. But if you've got 3 or 4 or 5 of those over a period of months, it's much tougher to come up with a believable explanation due to history. And finally, the term quasi-experiments. Quasi-experiments are when the independent variable is measured but not manipulated. There are some independent variables that we cannot manipulate. We cannot manipulate sex. Well, we can manipulate sex, but we cannot manipulate gender. So if we're looking at the effect of male versus female on some dependent measure, we have to take whatever differences there are between the genders as a given. We cannot manipulate age. We cannot manipulate intelligence. We cannot manipulate family life cycle. And all of those might be interesting independent variables. So they're called quasi-experiments because we know going in that there are some confounds, because we had to take people as representations of categories, and not, we sort of lose the ability to eliminate individual differences that might go along with those things. We still sort of analyze the results the same way we would experiments, but typically need to be more cautious in the interpretation.